Thank you, everyone. So before I start, I'm just curious to know how many people here are mobile app developers of one sort or another? Raise your hand. Anyone? OK. Less than I expected, but good. Then you're going to learn something, hopefully. And I want to try to convince you today that it's time to make mobile web apps. OK, everything's working. And as every mobile app developer knows, including you in the audience, to get decent market coverage today with a mobile app, you need to support at least the 3 major operating systems, meaning iOS, Android, and Windows Phone. OK, obviously, the Windows Phone thing was a joke. Sorry, just kidding. But still, implementing an app for iOS and Android essentially doubles the development effort and doubles the maintenance effort. And to do it properly, you probably have to spend significant additional time on UX to make sure that the look and feel is appropriate for the platform that you're targeting. And this state of affairs is nothing new. In my first job, which was in the early 90s, some of you were born probably, I was tasked with implementing a terminology management system for a translation company. And my boss told me you have to support Windows, Mac, and Linux. So I figured out all the multi-platform stuff, and I made an app, and it ended up looking something like this. It worked on all the target platforms, but it wasn't entirely satisfying anywhere. And this was when I came up with what I call my first law of multi-platform app development. You can have a good app, or you can have a multi-platform app, but you can't have both. And then the web came along. And while it was originally designed for exchanging documents, it quickly, and probably a little unexpectedly, became a really popular platform also for developing apps. So at first, web apps were very clunky. Some of you may remember you had to make a request to the server just to get the page, and then you waited for it to load. And every time the user interacted with a page, it had to go back to the server and load a whole new page. So it didn't really feel like a very smooth and satisfying app experience. But with the introduction of XML HTTP requests, despite this kind of crazy capitalization that they use, it became possible to make so-called single-page apps, which offer much better interactivity because they shift a lot of the business logic from the server tier to the browser tier, and the browser is just making requests to the server when it needs new data. So here's an example of a very early single-page application. Some of you may recognize this. It's Gmail, released in 2004, and it was really cutting edge at the time. I remember myself how revolutionary it seemed when this came out, and showed that in many ways a web app can be better than a desktop app. And partly this is possible, or it's possible to achieve the multi-platform sort of platform-consistent nature of an app like Gmail because it runs in a container, namely the web browser, which is designed from the beginning to be entirely operating system agnostic. And also, they introduced a UI paradigm that was consistent across all platforms, right? So you have hyperlinks, you have BAP button, and so forth. And you don't have to code your UI to a specific platform. You code it for the web platform, and it runs the same everywhere, right? So it's true that browsers differ in API support and performance, with Internet Explorer being the worst culprit. But still, even when people still used Internet Explorer, the effort to make a cross-platform web app was still a lot less than to have to make separate desktop apps for every platform. And libraries like jQuery cropped up pretty quickly that kind of smoothed over all the differences between the different platforms, so you could really have one single code base that ran everywhere. And so everything was rainbows and unicorns. The world was good. We'd solved the multi-platform problem. But unfortunately, this only lasted for about 10 minutes until the iPhone showed up and ruined everything. So why did the iPhone ruin everything? Well, in essence, mobile apps, which used to look like this, and again, I actually remember my Nokia Candy phone and using apps like this, but they started to look more like this, and developers decided that the web paradigm didn't really give them what they needed to create this new breed of slick mobile apps. And it really wasn't obvious that things were going to turn out that way when we first started to get to this sort of utopian multi-platform web future. And in fact, when the iPhone was first released, Steve Jobs famously announced that the web would be the SDK for the iPhone. But developers didn't like it, and they were up in arms. And the perception, I think, was that third-party devs weren't going to be able to compete with Apple and Apple's own apps if they didn't have access to a true native SDK. So Apple kind of quickly gave in, or maybe the whole thing was just a head fake in the first place, and they released like a real native SDK a few months after the iPhone was introduced. So the dream of a multi-platform future based on the web suffered a big setback. And then, to add insult to injury, in 2012, Mark Zuckerberg came out in public and said that using HTML5 for the Facebook mobile app was the biggest mistake they had made as a company. And I was like, really, Mark? In 8 years, this is the biggest mistake you ever made? But whatever. He said it. And of course, this only reinforced the sense that native was the way to make mobile apps, and somehow, like mobile web apps, they don't work well. And yet, the web has a lot of advantages. I might have mentioned it's multi-platform. Did I say that yet? OK, good. And that's not all. The web ecosystem is really big. It's really open. And as a result, the pace of innovation is much faster than for closed ecosystems like iOS and Android. I mean, if you look at all the stuff happening in the web space, it just makes your head spin. And there's some really incredible innovations all the time, and React hooks, and Vue, and what do I know, mob state tree. Much more is changing in the web space, and much more improvement is happening much faster than in the native app space. At least that's my opinion. And and that's true whether you're using Angular, React, Vue, or whatever new framework came out since I started this talk. And I think we're going to continue to see steady innovation and really cool things coming out in the web ecosystem much more than if Apple has to do it all itself or Google has to do it all themselves. Thirdly, it's often a requirement if I'm making a mobile app that I also want to deploy on the web. I mean, Gil said I run a software development agency, so I talk to a lot of clients and a lot of app developers, and I'd say it's more the rule than the exception. So it's not enough to just do mobile. So if you're making a web app and you're deploying that as your mobile app, well, hey, guess what? You have your desktop web app more or less for free. OK, it has to be responsive, et cetera, but it's still going to save you a lot of development effort. And another important reason is that, Another important consideration is a lot of companies already have their web expertise in place. And in a world where recruiting developers is a really daunting challenge, believe me, no one wants to have to recruit extra devs to do iOS, extra devs to do Android, train everybody in the right skill sets, manage those skill sets. So if you can use all the same skill sets across all the platforms you're targeting, I know I'm kind of echoing logic from the last talk with a slightly different take, but this is something that everybody is trying to do, right? So if you know how to do web apps, you don't have to learn anything new, and you don't have to manage any new skill sets if you're going to just use your web apps for mobile. Clearly a big advantage. And finally, what I often hear when speaking to clients and prospects is that there's a lot of resistance to this so-called Apple tax, right? Like every time you sell something in your native iOS app, you have to pay Apple 30% in most cases. And the same is true for Google, by the way. So I don't want to just bash Apple. But if you make a web app, then you can circumvent all that. And that's something that people are really interested in. I don't want to give 30% of all my revenue to Apple. So if I use a web app approach, problem goes away. So the question I ask myself when I look at all those advantages of the mobile web ecosystem is why? Namely, why did developers act so negatively to the announcement by Steve Jobs that the web would be the SDK for the iPhone? And why did Mark Zuckerberg consider Facebook's use of HTML5 to be such a huge mistake? So the biggest reason is definitely performance. I'm going to dive into this pretty deep. But the web was originally designed to display hypertext documents, right? It wasn't designed for apps. And it kind of shows. You might have a fairly simple application interface, but what's happening under the hood is still really, really complicated. And so here's a nice little example I have here of what you can do with the power of CSS. You can do amazing stuff like you can recreate the entire Star Wars intro using only HTML and CSS. I'm showing the entire code pen here so you can see this is not canned in any way. This is real time, page being generated. No JavaScript at all. And so it's impressive. But at the same time, the rendering process underneath to allow this kind of level of impressive effect that you probably don't need in your app kind of reminds me of a Rube Goldberg machine. And since probably none of you here know what a Rube Goldberg machine is, let me give you an example. So Rube Goldberg was this guy who was famous for making these crazy diagrams of these machines that didn't make any sense and were way too complicated than they needed to be, but were kind of funny. And the example here is an automatic back scratcher. So your back itches. What are you going to do? Of course, you're going to light your curtain on fire. And then the firemen come, and they spray water all over the curtain to put out the fire. But the water sprinkles on the dwarf, and the dwarf thinks, oh, it's raining. I better get an umbrella. He reaches up to grab the umbrella, pulls the umbrella down, and that pulls the string, which causes that platform to go up, and the big metal ball falls, pulling the other string, which causes the hammer to smash the mirror. It wakes up the baby pup, and the mommy dog starts rocking the pup to put it back to sleep, which causes the wooden arm to move and scratch her back. Simple, right? But to me, at least, this kind of reminds me of the way that browsers render HTML. This is a diagram of all the different components involved in Firefox's HTML rendering pipeline, and it kind of looks like that Rube Goldberg machine, right? Or not. It may just be me, but that was what sprung to mind when I started to think about how to explain how complicated the rendering process is when you're rendering HTML and CSS. And I worked in the Mozilla code base, actually, for quite a few years, so I can tell you that the code underlying all this is way worse. And there's, like, at least at the time, there was probably 2 people in the world who understood the CSS code in the Mozilla code base and were able to dive in there and make changes and fix bugs and so on. I mean, it is really, really complicated stuff. And it's no wonder with all that complexity that web interfaces have traditionally felt sluggish compared to native UIs. OK, another issue is access to native hardware and operating system services like the camera, the accelerometer, push notifications, and all that good stuff. When the iPhone first came out, there was no way to do any of this stuff, basically because nobody had ever tried to write a web app for a device that had any of those capabilities until the iPhone came out. It's also been a huge challenge to make web apps that behave sanely when you're not connected to the internet, right? Like traditionally, if you want to use a web app, you have to be connected all the time, and that's a huge disadvantage compared to native apps, which store their code directly on the device to avoid that problem. And last but certainly not least, there is no way, I mean, bear with me, this is not entirely true anymore, but for all intents and purposes, there's no way to distribute your web app on any of the app stores, whether it's the iOS App Store or Google Play. And as the 5 mobile app developers in the audience know, the app stores are really important distribution channels for your mobile app. So you're giving up a lot if you make a mobile app, and it might be great, but you can't put it in the app store. And especially if you manage to get your app featured, it can have a really big impact. So it's natural to worry that your users will have a hard time discovering your app if it's not in the app store, and that you're going to have to spend a lot more on marketing as a result. So now it seems like the case against mobile apps is pretty clear-cut, right? Well, I wouldn't be up here giving this talk if I really believed that, so let me talk about all those disadvantages and why I don't think that today, in 2019, they are so significant anymore. So starting with performance, remember Moore's law, right? The number of transistors on a chip doubles every 24 months or so, and if you keep doubling stuff enough, you get to some pretty big numbers, right? And there's a long tradition of technologies which were kind of too slow when they first came out, but without improving anything about the underlying technology, just from this evolution and from the inexorable march of Moore's law, these technologies became usable. A great example is Windows. I found this cute example. This is from a 1986 article in the New York Times. And the guy compares running Windows 1.0 to pouring molasses in the Arctic. And while I've never actually poured molasses in the Arctic, I'm pretty sure it's not very fast. And yet, it's probably safe to say that Windows has turned out pretty well for Microsoft, like several $100 billion later, right? And the reason, in a nutshell, is just that desktop computers kept getting faster and faster and faster, making Windows more and more usable, at least as far as performance is concerned. So now when we talk about mobile, they've experienced similarly rapid speed increases. I didn't find a more recent graph that showed like all the iPhone generations from the original iPhone all the way up to the present day, so I'm going to have to do a little bit of a mashup here. But as you can see on this first graph, the iPhone 6, which was released in 2014, was up to 84 times faster than the original iPhone. And for multi-core tasks, the iPhone XS is almost 5 times faster than the iPhone 6. So if we just multiply all the numbers together, we can see that the most recent iPhone is 400 times faster than the original iPhone. Except, not exactly, because as some eagle-eyed people out there might have noticed, this is based on a talk that I gave at one of our Salsida meetups a few months ago when the iPhone X or XS was the most recent model. And then Apple fucked everything up for me by coming out with a new model in the meantime. So I had to go in and research and see like how much faster the iPhone 11 is than the iPhone XS. And it turns out, according to the Geekbench benchmark, that is 20% faster, approximately, for whatever task. So it's actually not 400 times faster, but 480 times faster. And as you'll see in a minute, I actually have a few slides about this, so I had to do quite a lot of work to update it to accommodate the fact that it's not 400 anymore, it's 480. So please try to appreciate the extra effort that I put in just for this talk. So to give you a sense of perspective, if the iPhone was 400 times heavier, it would weigh as much as a full keg of beer, right? So it's 400 times faster, but if it were 4 times heavier, it would be huge. And if it were 480 times heavier, well, and I had to scratch my head about this, it would be as heavy as a slightly bigger keg of beer. Who would have thunk it? If the iPhone was 400 times cheaper, it would cost as much as a medium latte from Starbucks. And if the iPhone were 480 times cheaper, it would cost as much as a small latte from Starbucks. That's right. And finally, if the iPhone were 400 times long, oh, a second. Sorry, that's better. If the iPhone were 400 times longer, it would stretch as high as the Leaning Tower of Pisa. And if it were 480 times longer, it would be as tall as the Leaning Tower of Pisa with that little flag thingy on top. So basically what this means is that a lot of stuff that was unacceptably slow in 2007 is probably just fine now. And phones are getting faster all the time, so the trend is continuing, and the performance disadvantage of web apps is already arguably not that important. OK, access to hardware features also largely a solved problem. There have been web APIs for geolocation as far back as 2010, APIs for accessing the device's camera dating from 2012, and there are now existing standard APIs broadly supported for accessing accelerometer, gyroscope, and so forth. So if you need some super whizzy, crazy AR framework or something, might still be an issue. There's ways around that I'll talk about later. But for the broad range of hardware capabilities that you might want to access in a web app, you don't have to do anything clever at this point. It's all accessible via standard APIs. OK, let's talk about PWAs. Progressive web apps are another big step forward for mobile web apps and definitely have to be a part of this talk. Just a quick overview to anyone who's been living under a rock for the last couple of years. PWAs were introduced by Google in 2015, and they're actually a blanket term for a set of technologies that aim to give web apps the same capabilities as native mobile apps. And they're progressive because they can run like normal web apps in any browser. When you first load your progressive web app, it just looks like a web app. But then it will ask for additional capabilities as it needs it. And if you want to, you can say install it on my home screen, and it'll put an icon in your home screen, and it'll feel very much like a normal mobile app. So you can get to know your app gradually without jumping into bed on the first date, basically. And one important component, sorry, there we are. One important component of a PWA is the manifest. So this is just a file that says here's the name of the application, here's the URL, the icon, and so forth. And this makes it possible, among other things, to install the app on your home screen. And another really important component, maybe the most important component of the PWA framework, is service workers, which you can think of kind of like little mini local web servers that run in the background and allow your app to run when it's offline and to access capabilities like push notifications that require it to have some process running at all time. And in January of this year, almost a year ago now, Google added support for this Trusted Web Activity API, which means that you can embed a PWA inside an Android app and distribute the app in the Play Store. So that's why I said, when I said you can't put your app in the App Store, at least for Android, it's not actually the case anymore. If you do a PWA and use this API, then you can actually list your PWA just like a native app in the App Store. And so at least on Android, PWAs have really arrived, and your app can have pretty much all the capabilities of a native app, even be listed in the store, but with all the advantages that I mentioned for mobile web apps, multi-platform, usable in the web browser, et cetera. On iOS, the picture is a bit murkier. Apple added some key PWA features last year, including support for service workers, so it seems like they are at least somewhat interested in this space. But you can't list PWAs in the App Store, and there are some really important key capabilities that are still missing, like push notifications, that aren't supported by mobile Safari. So it's anyone's guess when and if Apple is going to add these features. They're famously secretive. But we won't really achieve parity with Android, and we won't really be able to rely on all the capabilities of PWAs for making multi-platform apps until Apple supports all this stuff. In the meantime, and this is an approach that personally I like and use, Gil mentioned my wine app, and we're using exactly this approach. It's a React web app wrapped using Cordova. So what is Cordova? Probably most people at least have a notion about this. It's an open source successor of a framework called PhoneGap, and in essence, it wraps any web app in a native container so that it can be installed and run like a native app, and they have this so-called native bridge that lets you call from JavaScript into the native code and access any native capabilities of the device that aren't accessible via normal web APIs. So basically, if you're using this, you have no limitations. You can do anything that a native app can make. You don't hear about it that much anymore, but I would say rumors of its demise are greatly exaggerated. And most significantly, probably, it's used by this really popular Ionic framework, which has like some number of stars, 38,000 stars on GitHub, so it's pretty popular. And they use Cordova to wrap your Ionic app so that it can have some of these capabilities of a native app. And a lot of people use Ionic, so as a result, a lot of people use Cordova. However, again, more or less since I first gave this talk, Ionic has come out with this new generation Cordova-like thing called Capacitor, but basically same difference, right? It's just more modern, it's made a lot of improvements, but the idea is the same. I can make a web app, and I can use all the capabilities that the web platform gives me, and I'm like ready for when the web platform continues to evolve and improve. But if I need to get my app out now and use capabilities that aren't available to me right now, like if I want to do push notifications on iOS, which is probably something almost every mobile app developer wants to do, then I can just wrap it in a container like this, and I get all the capabilities I want now, but I'm also future-proofed, right? OK, so if only it were that simple, but any talk about the merit of mobile web apps compared to native iOS and Android development really needs to mention React Native as well. So luckily, the previous speaker gave you a bunch of details about this, so I don't have to give you a complete explanation of what React Native is, and I wasn't planning to do it anyway, by the way. But just to give you a very short summary, it uses the same general approach as React. Anyone here familiar with React? You have your markup, you have your automatic like diffing and rendering only what you need. You have that great React-based functional approach to programming. But instead of generating a web UI, it generates a native mobile UI, and it really generates native mobile widgets from your markup. And it uses a subset of CSS. So instead of inventing some crazy proprietary markup language or having to learn whatever Apple or Android requires you to do in order to lay your website out, you can just use the same CSS or a subset of the CSS that you know and love. And this approach has a lot of advantages. The most obvious is that because React Native is based on React, it has the same declarative approach and can take advantage of a lot of the huge React ecosystem. If there are libraries for React that do cool stuff, in a lot of cases you can use those in React Native as well. And the React ecosystem is huge. So that's a really huge benefit. And since May of this year, you can even use hooks, which is one of the latest cool React things. So in a nutshell, React is really, really great. I am personally a huge React fan, and a lot of that greatness just automatically by osmosis is rubbed off on React Native. And the app compiles down into from a single code base into a native iOS and Android app. You can then drop in whatever native code you need. So if there aren't already existing features in React Native to do what you want, then you can write so-called native modules. And in fact, to an always greater extent, there are actually modules that are available out there that are going to allow you to do what you want without having to code them yourself. And of course, the result looks and acts completely native because it is completely native, right? All you're doing is you're using JavaScript instead of Swift or Kotlin or whatever else there is out there to generate a true native mobile interface. There are some drawbacks as well. And this is based on some real first-hand experience at Salzita. We have a lot of HTML and CSS expertise in the company. It helps, of course, because with React Native you're using CSS, but it is quite a different, much more limited dialect of CSS than what you're using in the web environment. So just be prepared. It's going to take a certain amount of time to learn and master this special dialect of CSS. And rumor has it that creating good animations is also something that requires a certain amount of learning. Same is true of the build configurations. I think the good news is once you've got your build configuration set up, it's done. You don't have to touch it anymore. And if your continuous integration is set up properly, you'll just commit to your repository and your apps will get built. There's also stuff like Expo that makes it a lot easier to handle these build challenges as long as you don't end up having to eject from Expo. And also, although it is true that the markup for iOS and Android in React Native is fundamentally the same, and we saw in the previous talk that you can also use the same markup for generating web interfaces, there are some differences, and there will be cases where if you want to achieve a particular more platform-specific effect, you would have to use different markup on the different platforms. So if you have a web app, same code everywhere. React Native, same code everywhere, kind of, but maybe not 100%. And the last thing it is still, even after 4 years, a little bit bleeding edge. The thing I hear a lot from people who are using React Native regularly is every time they do an update, it breaks my code, right? So just be prepared. I think it's an amazing innovation. It's very cool, but it is still fairly early days for React Native. OK, so finishing up, I still think React Native is great, despite those drawbacks, but PWAs offer stiff competition. And I talk regularly to clients who wouldn't even consider making a non-native app for whatever reason. Rightly, wrongly, they believe they need native. For those people, yeah, React Native could be a really good choice for you. I firmly believe that something like React Native is still way better in today's software development environment than writing 2 separate apps for iOS and Android. And on the other hand, if you have strong in-house web skills, or you need to target the web, or you just want to have really the same code everywhere you're deploying, then I think that a PWA is something that you should seriously consider. And I should just very quickly say there are some other options. Xamarin, if you're a .NET house, maybe look at Xamarin as an alternative. You can also use one code base to make native, true native multi-platform apps. And there's this thing called Flutter from Google, which uses the Dart language. I think it's pretty early days for that. If I were you, I'd probably wait, see what kind of traction it's getting before I commit to that particular framework. So in summary, mobile web apps have many significant advantages over native apps, but they've been hurt by negative attitudes that date back from the introduction of the original iPhone. But to a large extent, those objections are now outdated. Mobile devices are just way faster than they were in 2007, and the web standards have come a long way since then as well, giving you access to native hardware features and all culminating in the introduction of PWAs. And at least on Android, PWAs have really come pretty close at this point to achieving parity completely with native platforms. And on iOS, we can hope that that's going to happen. Apple has signaled their interest by at least supporting service workers. And in the meantime, you can use something like Cordova or Capacitor to bridge the gap. So while we might not be there just yet, it might be time to start questioning my first law of multi-platform development. And maybe, just maybe, with advances in hardware capabilities and the technology behind mobile web apps, we'll be able to make apps that are both multi-platform and good. So thank you very much. And if anybody has any questions, now's the time. Thank you.